Well, good afternoon. I'm here at the Equality and Human Rights Commission with Legal Director Elizabeth Prochaska. Thank you very much for talking with Regulation Matters this afternoon, Elizabeth. It's great to be here.
Great to meet you.
So tell us a little bit about the Commission and the work that it does.
Well, the Equality and Human Rights Commission is a state body, completely independent of government. It's also the National Human Rights Institution accredited under the United Nations treaties, and we are responsible for protecting, promoting and enforcing equality and human rights law in Great Britain.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And earlier this year, I think it was in March, the Commission published a report called Turning the Tables, Ending Sexual Harassment at Work. What was the background to that report?
Well, the background is one that all your viewers will be very familiar with. It's the Me Too movement. The Commission has a responsibility for ensuring enforcement of the sexual harassment and harassment laws in the Equality Act, and when we saw what was happening with the Me Too movement, we wanted to do our part to harness the power of that movement to really change British workplaces and make sure that people are protected from harassment by their employers.
And in that report you make a number of recommendations to government. Could you summarise what those are?
The principal recommendations are the creation of a mandatory duty on employers to protect their employees, supplemented by a statutory code of practice on harassment, which would flesh out the meaning of that mandatory duty. That will require an amendment to the Equality Act 2010, and we have received support for those recommendations from the Women and Equality Select Committee, so we're hoping that they will be taken forward by government.
Okay, great. And thinking practically, what should someone do if they've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace?
Well, the first thing to do is familiarise themselves with their employers' policies. All employers will have a anti-harassment and bullying policy of some kind. It might be separate or wrapped up in their general equality policy. They must seek support. That support could be from a trusted friend or colleague, it could be from a trade union representative, and then think very carefully about whether or not they want to report the incident and find out what the reporting mechanisms are in their workplace. And once they've reported, they will need to be clear about whether they want to go through with an investigation and so forth. And in our experience, that can be a very difficult decision for someone to make, so they need to ensure they've got support when they're making that decision. And of course, if they're in a regulated profession, like legal executive profession, they need to consider whether they should be reporting to the regulator as well as to their employer.
Okay, thank you. And thinking then from the employer's perspective, what ideally should employers be doing to protect their employees from sexual harassment in the workplace?
The first thing to say is this is about culture. Policies are important, but a policy is only ever as good as the person who's implementing it. So it's really about culture, and that comes from the leadership down through an organisation. So it needs to be clear from the leadership that they have zero tolerance for harassment of any kind, including, of course, sexual harassment. That should be reflected in all sorts of ways, whether it's in training, whether it's in staff surveys and so on. The employer needs to ensure that people are enabled to report harassment and that they protect those who do report, so that they're not subject to victimisation in the workplace, which unfortunately is all too common an experience. They then need to conduct fair and robust investigations and impose appropriate sanctions if a person is found to have harassed another colleague.
Okay, and what about the Commission? What powers does the Commission have in this area?
The Commission has a range of enforcement powers. We're not a regulator in the traditional sense, so we don't have sort of regulatory powers to inspect workplaces, but we have enforcement powers which we can use where we suspect that harassment has occurred. We can investigate the organisation. We're really only likely to do that in cases where there are maybe multiple issues, or it's really systemic, or perhaps it's a very large employer. But we certainly have the appetite to do that, and we are looking at a number of different cases at the moment.
Okay, and am I right in saying there's a number of helpful resources on the EHRC website which we could put on Regulation Matters?
Yes, we produced guidance for employers on sexual harassment in December last year. and we are in the process of drafting the code that I referred to. And even if Parliament doesn't pass a mandatory duty for employers, we are going to set out a code of practice on harassment based on the existing law, which I hope will give employers and employees some guidance about what to expect and what they should be doing in this space.
Okay, great. So we'll look out for the code. Linking back to the recommendations that you made back in March, what else is on the agenda? You talked about changes to the Equalities Act, and government's presumably very busy with Brexit at the moment. So,
we made additional recommendations around data collection and research, and we hope that some of those will be taken forward both by the Westminster Government but also by the devolved governments. And we made recommendations around non-disclosure agreements, and in fact the Solicitors Regulation Authority has already taken some of that forward with a warning notice to solicitors, which I think legal executives will be very interested in as well, which sets out the sort of ethical obligations of lawyers when they are involved in drafting non-disclosure agreements. And I think the BSB is likely to follow suit too. So there's work going on there around non-disclosure agreements, and I think people should just be alive to kind of regulatory updates on these issues in the future.
okay, great. Elizabeth, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Thank you.